Okay, I think we are ready to go. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. Conscious it's the festive season. You may have more interesting places to be, Christmas parties and the like, or we may have saved you from having to wrap presents. So if we have done that, you're welcome. We are here to discuss the excitement of CQC and dentistry in 2025 from compliance to consequences. In the next 45 minutes to an hour, we'll be exploring the regulatory landscape for dentistry in 2025 and onwards. It's a landscape that's become more rigorous than ever. The CQC scrutinises dental practices with the same rigour it applies to hospitals and care providers, but tailored to the realities of dental care. So this session isn't just about compliance, it's about understanding the real-world consequences of falling short, from inspection findings to enforcement action. Our goal tonight is to help you not just to pass inspections, but to build a culture of safety, quality, and patient trust. Now, we'll go through some key questions and answers about the CQC's powers, approach, and expectations for dentistry today. But this is designed to be an interactive session, so you've probably all got your question bar there, so feel free to drop questions in as the evening progresses. If we can answer them, we'll try and do so live. If for whatever reason we aren't able to do so, I'm told we can follow up with you directly afterwards. So one way or another, you should get a response to your question. Just a bit about us. My name is Jon Lawley. I'm a corporate healthcare partner at Acuity Law, working out of our Cardiff office. We are a UK-wide law firm. We are business to business, and we specialise in helping dental practices. I've worked with dental practices for over a decade now, mostly in M&A, so buying and selling practices, but also on the day-to-day running of their businesses. As a firm, we cover corporate, commercial, real estate. We help dentists with disputes. We help dentists with immigration for their teams. And we also help dentists with the regulatory aspects of their business as well. And on that note, I'm delighted to introduce my colleague, Jenny Wilde. Jenny specialises in helping health and social care providers, care homes, GPs, and most importantly, dental practices with navigating the choppy waters of the regulatory landscape in England, obviously being the CQC, but also works on the GDC as well. So Jenny, I'll hand over to you just for a brief introduction to tell everyone a bit more about yourself.
Thanks a lot, John. As John said, I'm Jenny. I'm a health and social care regulatory partner at Acuity. My clients range from NHS hospitals to care homes, children's homes, dentists, anybody that's regulated by any of the UK's regulators. This particular session is aimed at dentists, and as John has mentioned, it's a terrain that dentists aren't necessarily used to. I find my clients quite shocked when the regulator knocks on their door. So my job is essentially to guide people through enforcement action, tricky inspections, any kind of scenario that causes them alarm in their day-to-day operations. I'm the person that people don't want to call in a crisis.
But I'm sure they're delighted you're there when they do.
Eventually.
Good stuff. Well, I think on that note, let's dive in then. I've got a few questions which I think hopefully should expand a bit more on maybe some of the more basic elements of how the CQC would interact with dental practices, maybe as opposed to some of the larger care organizations you deal with, Jenny, but then also maybe get into a bit more detail around some of the common pitfalls you come across. So I think on that note, let's start with a bit of a broader question. So in your opinion, what are the main differences then between CQC inspections for dental practices as opposed to other healthcare providers like hospitals and GP surgeries?
Well, CQC operates on a single assessment framework, John, which is the same across all types of services at the moment. It has gone through a period of transition, so everybody's subject to the same regime. So every provider that's regulated will be assessed under the key questions of, are you safe, effective, caring, responsive, well-led? Inspections in dentistry are slightly different because they're tailored to smaller, high-volume practices. The CQC are aware that there's a distinct difference in dentistry, say, compared to a large residential care home or an NHS hospital. And understandably, different issues arise in different types of service. So in a dental practice, the main focus will be on infection control, record keeping, consent, clinical governance. there is an understanding and recognition with the regulator that those dental teams are smaller and their day-to-day operation is more procedural than other types of settings. So they will approach the practice in a more pragmatic way with that in mind, to the dentist's benefit.
Yeah, and is that a consistent approach, Jenny? I mean, does the CQC across the board treat dental practices in that way, or do they ever misapply standards, which they might apply to, say, larger organizations and try and impose them on dental practices, or is that very much set in stone? That's the way things are done.
It's the way that it's always been, and I think, to be honest, dentists have always been given a lot more grace than other types of providers that I've seen through my practice, which now it's been about 15 years dealing with different types of provider. And anecdotally, dentists do, and it might not feel like this for people watching this, but dentists do get a lighter touch. So there is more of a collegiate relationship. It's a little bit of an easier experience, say, than going to a larger service and having things turned upside down. That's not to say it isn't challenging, but it's actually the other way around to what you suggest. It's a friendlier, more predictable experience, and the standard is very much within the realms of, oh, this is a dental practice, I know what I'm looking for here.
Understood. Okay, that's helpful. So kind of getting a bit more into the detail then. So how does the CQC determine which practices to inspect, and how often are the inspections carried out?
It depends. Dental practices, in my experience, are often surprised by how forensic inspections can feel, even though they might be a small scale service in the provider's eyes. And dentists sometimes expect inspections to be informal or advisory, but that same regulatory threshold is applied as it would be to a larger provider. And the shock among dentists is the emphasis on governance evidence rather than the CQC coming in and looking at their clinical skill. I think dentists are far more used to being forced to prove their skill and account for their skill day to day in various ways, but CQC's approach is just to come in and look at risk. So to look at your documentary evidence around risk assessments, where there have been incidents, looking at your learnings from those incidents, and to see what your structured oversight is, really, who's watching the watcher, even in a single chair practice. So the size and risk profile of a dental practice will influence how the inspection is conducted, but not the standards applied. The same standard will apply. But I think that smaller practices, whilst beholden to the same standard, can expect a shorter inspection because there's probably fewer things to look at. But areas like infection control, radiography, and safeguarding will always be looked at in depth. I think because of the nature of dentistry, it's invasive and high volume.
Yeah.
What CQC wants to look at is consistency and repeatability of systems rather than isolated example of good care. So they'll be looking for trends and patterns.
Understood. Okay. And how frequently are dental practices subject to inspections at the moment?
It has been a real mixed bag, I would say. People may or may not be aware of I would describe it as a bit of a farce, and it hasn't gone unnoticed in the dental sector, of the way that the CQC system of inspection has changed. So if we compare it to residential care services, I have some clients that haven't been inspected for 5 years, but social care is regarded as a higher risk area than dentistry. So it does depend, but ultimately inspections can be routine. But what's happening at the moment is risk-based inspections. So that means when CQC get information on a complaint from a patient, a whistleblower from a staff member, or any concern from the NHS or a commissioner, they will come in and take a look. Plus, it's worth noting that any practice that has had previous dealings with the CQC through enforcement action or a prior breach, or delivers a particularly complex service that CQC isn't that familiar with, and thus might be a little bit skeptical of, they will be under a little bit more scrutiny. And the same goes for practices with high patient turnover, it could be that they face more frequent inspections, understandably.
Yeah. Okay. And in this age of social media and everyone being able to have their say on a wider scale, do complaints need to be made directly to the CQC, or can the CQC pick up on patterns and trends on public forums, public spaces, and decide to take action from there? Have you come across anything like that in your experience?
I have seen that, especially on Trustpilot, actually.
Okay.
This wasn't in dentistry, but I've seen it in different sectors within the health and social care space. People venting about a particular service that they've received from a clinic or a GP practice, for example, and that can absolutely alert the CQC. I think one way of negating that is having a really good and robust and clear complaints policy in place that will deter patients going straight to these public forums or the CQC. I think it's worth encouraging staff to whistleblow as and when concerns arise to you, the provider, to have feedback forms, to have discussions so that you're getting the concerns then and there, rather than them going straight to the regulator and it being escalated unnecessarily. But it's not just information from publicity or, let's take X or Facebook, for example. CQC will look at enforcement history, they'll look at unmet regulations, statutory notifications that you, the dentist, are legally obliged to submit, but also data returns that you are required to put in before the inspection happens. So we have seen a massive increase in risk responsive inspections emanating from all of those areas, these arms of feedback and complaint or venting. But unfortunately, it's very rare that somebody should put on Google, I had a wonderful experience at Oak Tree Dental Surgery, and then CQ come in and give you an outstanding. It's generally people complaining and giving bad news stories that trigger an inspection. And on that basis, CQC can tend to come in and zero in on the concern that they have that's been precipitated by that complaint. So they're already crossing your threshold with a bit of a negative view.
Yeah, but it sounds like that's more of a, it would need to be more than one malicious posting on a website. It's the CQC would build up a picture with multiple sources of evidence. It's not just someone can't be brought down by one aggrieved patient who feels like they've been overcharged or underdelivered. It's a lot more. It takes a lot more than that, which I suppose gives people some comfort, because in all walks of life you always get people who aren't happy, don't you?
Absolutely, and I guess the way that you deal with that is creating a forum for those people to come to you first.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's really helpful. Thanks, Jenny. Just touching on something you raised around the 5 key questions. So, can we go into a bit more detail around that, around the questions the CQC asks during the inspections? How do they translate specifically into dental practices?
Yeah. So these key questions are the same across the board in all settings in health and social care. So the first most important question that they look at is whether people using the service are safe. And in a dental practice, they'll be zeroing in on infection control, sharps handling, is that safe for the people involved in that, and the safety of your radiography where appropriate. The second key question is how effective your service is. So to determine that, the CQC will look at evidence that's available there on site to see how effective treatments have been, whether treatment plans are being followed, how well trained staff are, for example, and how effective people are day to day, and looking at the outcomes for patients in that as well. Caring is the third key question, and they will look at the way that your practice communicates with patients. They look at how you obtain consent. If they observe a surgery or if they're there in interactions between reception and patients, they'll take that into consideration as well. The penultimate question is whether your service is responsive. So the CQC will come in and look at how easy it is to get an appointment. Are you accessible? As I mentioned earlier, how do you handle complaints? If somebody comes to you with an issue, how quickly are you dealing with that? Or are you just inviting complaints and then not doing anything about it? It's about follow through in being responsive. So having clear policies on complaints and other things that demonstrate your responsiveness are really important. And in my opinion, the most important key question is how well led you are. In determining how well led you are, it's more of an overarching review by the CQC. So they'll come in and look at your governance structures, they'll look at your policies and procedures more generally. And a crucial part of any practice is audits, risk management, near misses, any adverse events that have happened. So yeah, combined together, it's quite a draining experience because everything is looked at.
Yeah, I mean, out of those 5 questions, do you find the dental practices tend to kind of fall short on anyone more than any of the others, or is it a case by case basis depending on which practice you're dealing with?
Thematically, John, I would say most people struggle with well led. And I think the reason for that is it's not down to people showing a lack of care or professionalism. In dental practice, oftentimes there can be an insufficient formalization of leadership and governance because of the way that practices have come together, or the way that they operate day to day, or the relationships that are held internally. And so those types of practices can rely on informal oversight, the assumption of clinical competence, and how that equates to organizational effectiveness. So using some examples of typical weaknesses, you might say a lack of structured audits or a failure to act on audit findings, or poor documentation or decision-making and risk management, or limited evidence of learning from incidents or complaints. So that goes back to what I was saying about having the policies. That's all well and good, but unless you're enacting them and showing some follow through, the CQC will regard you as not being well led. And that key question actually underpins all domains. So if you're criticised for something unsafe, for example, and then it's looked at again and well led, it will contribute adversely in both areas. And that could contribute to wider compliance issues and enforcement action later down the line.
Thanks, Josh. Well, again, this may be kind of based on your experience, and maybe if you've got any examples you can give to kind of put some flesh on the bone, that'd be great. But in terms of kind of the most common compliance issues that you find tend to lead to enforcement action against dental practices, what do you see kind of coming up more often than not?
I would say majorly poor infection control. There's a lot of equipment in dental practices, and dentists should not be under any illusion that CQC won't look at that. They will come and look at your cleanliness. They'll come and look at your equipment, chairs, everything, your schedules for cleaning, who's responsible for infection control champions. Because of the nature of dentistry, it's absolutely crucial. So the enforcement actions I've dealt with historically relate to equipment, and not just cleanliness, but adequacy. How often is your chair checked upon? Yeah. How often is your equipment looked at to ensure that it's best possible standard in these invasive procedures? Clinical records is major, and just having complete and clean records, especially in staff training. And I think in a dental practice, everybody's really keen to get the job done and to do it well. And sometimes training can take a lot of time away from practice under high pressures. And I've seen a lot of examples in warning notices and enforcement action against dentists where training matrices have been used to show that people haven't attended certain modules, or that person doesn't know about safeguarding, or that person isn't aware of this new infection control procedure. What I would say there is it's crucial to mark everything down, record everything, because in the CQC's view, if it isn't written down, it didn't happen, and they are a creature of evidence. So having that and being able to produce it to them would have made my client's life a lot easier, because the staff had actually done the training. It just wasn't written down anywhere, and it's such a simple thing to remedy. Yeah. And just generally weak governance for the same reasons I mentioned previously, and that's reliance on informal relationships. And a lack of understanding on who's running the regulatory side of this business. Is it everybody's responsibility? Is somebody leading the charge? Do you have a registered manager? So I think that's the kind of thing that can really snowball into big enforcement action. And they can just be small things that just add up.
And do you think in some ways the kind of relatively lighter touch the CQC applies to dental practices almost encourages this I suppose kind of lack of focus on, you say, this kind of good clinical governance leadership? Do you think it's almost a kind of a byproduct of the CQC focusing more on the larger organizations?
Yeah, I think so. It's kind of not resting on your laurels, because I know every dentist will be aware of CQC and just kind of have it in the back of their mind. And I'm sure that dentists on this call and around the country will have now been inspected by the CQC. So I'd be keen to hear in the questions and comments what people have to say about their own experiences with those inspections. But yeah, I do think that dentists can be shocked when they have a CQC visit, because it probably has previously been quite light touch, as you say, or a little bit, let's just go through these motions and just tick you off and make sure everything's a-okay. But with the I'll say the new regime that's now being adapted again, and in a way that we don't yet know, it's risk-based. So for the reasons I mentioned earlier, inspectors are being a little bit more rigorous about following the risk in any type of service. So dentists won't be exempt from that risk-based approach from the CQC. So whilst they might have had something that seemed a bit more pally previously, it's going to seem a little bit more invasive and punitive potentially.
Yeah. Okay. We've had a question posted, which I think probably goes back to the point you said around encouraging whistleblowing, and maybe this is a step on from that. But the question is, can an ex-employee who had concerns prior to resigning from their position still raise concern to the CQC? I think in this instance, they wanted to do this whilst working at the practice, but felt they would not be able to do so. So I suppose the question is, Jenny, the CQC, is it available to everyone, patients, employees, ex-employees? Is it a forum that anybody can go and raise issues and complaints?
It absolutely is, John. Yeah. And that's what everybody should be mindful of. It's literally just the ability to fill in an online form anonymously. And that's a real source of frustration for providers registered with the CQC. It doesn't always have to have a name attached to it, but CQC will look at it through the prism in which it's being delivered. So if somebody is saying, I'm a former employee, I have this and this concern, if it seems reasonable and not vexatious, they may just contact you and say, look, and I see this all the time, it is an open, transparent dialogue from the inspector to the practice. They will be quite open with it and say, look, we've had this complaint, what do you have to say about it? So sometimes they will give you a heads up and allow you the opportunity to kind of respond if they have a question mark around the validity of such a whistleblower. But if it's a serious issue that could cause immediate risk of harm to people, the CQC could absolutely visit you and base an inspection, and it would be called a focused inspection, around that particular issue. So in short, yes, anybody can make a complaint.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. There's a few more questions coming through, but I think if we move on, then we'll try and address them as we go on. But I think there's a few other points we wanted to cover off in the session, and time seems to be moving on. So I think Jenny, what I was hoping to get into next was probably trying to differentiate between what could be perceived to be a minor breach and a serious failure, and actually whether there's any kind of grey area, or whether it's easy for these things to escalate and for minor breaches to kind of quickly become serious. So again, I think maybe kind of some of your experience, some of your thoughts around how the CQC differentiates between minor breaches and serious failures might be a good place to start with that one.
Yeah, and it's kind of like a driving test, John. Little minor breaches can just be standalone mistakes, and in those eventualities, it might result in the CQC coming to you during an inspection or in the feedback session thereafter to give you some advice or recommendations. Now, unfortunately, CQC really are reluctant to give you advice. They'll criticize you, but then when you say, okay, well, what would you prefer to see? They'll say, can't tell you. They won't give you any specific advice, but they can kind of funnel you into a way of changing what they don't think works. So there is scope there for a more supportive relationship. I wish more inspectors were like that. So where there are little things, they can set you back on course in real time, which is great. But if there are more serious things that kind of rotate around unsafe treatment or repeated breaches of the same issues, in particular infection control, staff negligence issues, or just general inadequacies and with competencies amongst staff, that can trigger a warning. A notice of proposal to cancel your registration, for example, or even, and that would result in closure, effectively. So it can go from a little nudge, a warning notice, which isn't quite as bad. You can remedy that with an action plan. Something a bit more serious, a proposal to cancel your registration, which isn't a decision, it's just a suggestion they might take that action, all the way through to the decision to close you and then the closure. So it's about the cumulative effect and sorting things out really early doors.
Okay. And if a dental practice fails to meet standards, what's the CQC's powers then in that situation? What for a practice owner, what are the practical implications if they've fallen below the standard required?
Well, it varies. They can issue advice, a warning notice, as I said, enforcement notices. They can apply a condition onto your registration, restricting the types of services that you provide, or in extreme cases, just completely cancel or suspend your registration. That's the most shocking outcome. And I will say that in 15 years, I've only ever seen that happen successfully twice. And that's because people tend to improve themselves through the course of those proceedings. So even if you get a notice that might happen, it isn't the end of the road. It's just a suggestion that you need to be better. It's the kick up the backside that the CQC think that you need. But receiving those will naturally have an effect on staff confidence, morale, your ability to operate legally, your reputation, and patient trust, which is obviously major. And I've seen some examples of serious enforcement action in recent months. Actually, there was a dentist who decided he had been in trouble with the GDC, he'd been struck off, but continued to practice dentistry without CQC registration. So business as usual for him. Unfortunately, he was found out. CQC issued various notices and actually prosecuted him. And that's an important thing to remember as well. CQC have very strong criminal prosecution powers. And this dentist was ordered to complete a 12-month community order, 15 days rehabilitation, and ordered to pay a fine of £5,000, £3,000 prosecution costs, victim surcharges, and the dentist was disqualified from being a director for 3 years because it's a criminal offence to carry on dental services without registration. So it really does vary. So that's the one end of the scale. The other end of the scale is receiving a warning notice about something you're not doing quite correctly. The CQC pick up on it. And what the CQC do often is issue a press release. And local papers love that. They will pick that up and write about these things that have been found because it's an easy headline in a local newspaper. So their powers are significant, and the action they can take doesn't just affect your practice day to day, but the reputational damage that they can cause is also major. And they're a publicity beast, so they do love a press release.
Yeah, and so it sounds like everything from the CQC's perspective is entirely public. So it sounds like what you're saying is no matter what the outcome is, any notices they serve, that's going to be in the public domain. So it sounds like it's pretty easy to, in a poorly run practice, to sleepwalk into these reputational issues, even if it's not a kind of huge issue in the long term, and it can be easily remedied. It sounds like it's it can cause a lot of damage quite quickly. So looking at, I suppose, where you come in then, Jenny, and how you work with practices day to day. So if someone gets a notice of action, enforcement action, a warning notice, whatever kind of notice it might be, at what point should they be kind of looking to get advice and looking to actually, I suppose, kind of get some assistance from someone like yourself to help them, kind of either kind of accept what it is, or to push back and to actually kind of refute what was in the notice?
Yeah, I would say as soon as enforcement action looks like it's a possibility, not after the CQC has taken action. The moment you receive a letter from the CQC, your brain should trigger into the mode of, this is the type of action, it's the course of action that could end in a tribunal. It's the kind of action that could end in my closure, or that could end in damage to my reputation. So as soon as you get anything that's marked enforcement action, breach of regulation, I would always recommend getting support from a lawyer, and that can be receipt of a warning notice or requirement notice, conditions on your registration, any allegations involving patient harm or safeguarding. I think that's a really good moment to contact a lawyer as well. And repeat inspections highlighting the same issues, even if you haven't yet had a notice. If you yourself can spot that trend and that pattern, that gives you a heads up. The CQC have spotted it too. Or any threat of interference in your business from the CQC. Getting advice sooner rather than later can save you a lot of heartache and hardship later down the line.
Yeah, but also in identifying those trends yourself before the CQC picks them up directly with you, I suppose it shows a level of self-awareness that you're on top of what's going on in your practice, and if things haven't gone right, even though the CQC haven't raised it with you yet, you're taking steps to put it right. So I suppose that would put you in a good light with them as and when they come to speak to you about it.
Exactly, John. But also, even in a basic inspection, that goes into your well-led category.
Yeah.
If you're conducting your own audits and governance, spotting these issues, it's okay that the issues exist. Issues will arise through the course of any practice. But as long as you're identifying them, remedying them within a reasonable time frame, you can show that you spotted it. And actually, that's a really big tick in the box under the well-led category.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So looking at inspections then, so what are your tips for how dental practices should prepare for inspections, Jenny?
Well, I'll go back to the old adage, John, if it didn't get written down, it didn't happen. So it's all about documentary evidence. That's so crucial. So keep your documentation up to date. That includes staff records, all of the audits that you're performing, your policies and procedures. We've just mentioned your internal audits. They should be regular and comprehensive. Conducting those internal checks on IPC, equipment maintenance and radiation safety, and recording all of that is crucial. And I think what's really important is being able to demonstrate a learning culture. And again, things happen and you can't avoid that. The worst thing that you can do is hide it, but you can do a lessons learned exercise on anything that does occur, incident reporting and feedback, and most importantly, kind of the way that you manage and train the people that work at the practice. So ensuring that staff are competent, that they're well trained and aware of their responsibilities. And I would always try and do a mock inspection and prepare these people for inspections, because when people are put under the spotlight and a CQC inspector says, well, did you do your training on X, Y, or Z? They will think that they are individually going to get into trouble for saying, no, I don't remember that particular thing. And more often than not, they'll turn around and say, I didn't have that training. And it turns back on the provider. And I've seen numerous inspection reports where the CQC has concluded the provider did not deliver that training. And if they had checked the training matrix or the documentation, they would have seen that the staff member did get the training. They just panicked and didn't know what to say, so kind of blamed their employer, which is a silly thing to do. So it's relaxing people and preparing them for the inspection experience.
Okay. Another question that's been posted, which I suppose is relevant here. It's a question around compliance software, really, and I know there are there is compliance software on the market which helps people kind of meet their CQC requirements. I suppose the question is, what's the general view on compliance software? I think this person asking the question said they find it quite helpful to see what's missing, but they're also just checking it doesn't make the practice look like they're just approaching compliance as a tick box exercise. So I suppose your view, Jenny, would be whatever helps you meet the standards can only be a positive thing. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, it is. I think whatever tool you have to collate your policies, for example, or your audits, or to put into one space your governance, can't be a bad thing. but those systems are only as good as the information you put into them. So as staff being trained on how to complete that work or how to interact with that software, the worst thing that you can do is have a system in place and people are failing to use it. Because if we're going to introduce the CQC to this wonderful, bright and shiny compliance/governance system, but it's got gaps in it, and maybe other people around the service are recording things on a paper log, everybody has to be on the same page. But I think there's a preference at the moment across all health and social care sectors to digitalise, to make things easier. And one major plus of those electronic compliance systems is being able to create data, graphs, any kind of graphic that will show you trends and patterns so that you can address them before the CQC does. So yeah, 2 thumbs up from me as long as used properly.
Good. And how black and white would you say the standards are, Jenny? I mean, I suppose kind of using the word or using the phrase tick box exercise. Can CQC compliance be approached just as that, or actually are there points where the CQC and the practice owner will disagree because there's some ambiguity in terms of the standards being set? What's your kind of experience in maybe the kind of the common areas of disagreement between the CQC and practice owners as to whether certain standards have been met or not?
Yeah, I mean, at the heart of all care, be it within the NHS, dentistry, at a care home, wherever, the objective is to deliver person-centred care. And that's what CQC will go in looking for. So if you're just creating a tick box that things have been done, that might be frowned upon. But what I will say is in dentistry, it probably is more acceptable to tick box, because you are doing such procedural work that has to be really strictly managed and regimented, that I would expect to see some level of tick box, but I would like to see that complemented by good plans, good information post-care, service delivery, information about the patients, lots of detailed information about consent where appropriate, and other things that you can bring in that reflect the patient. Because we've spoken a lot about infection control and procedures, but really at the heart of this is patient care and keeping people safe. So I would want to see a little bit of both in dental practices, John, and I think CQC would expect to see the same.
Okay. We've touched on feedback and the role that feedback plays in the CQC forming a view of a practice. I suppose I wonder, in terms of the kind of next step of actually how a practice deals with feedback, whether it's through the CQC or whether it's directly, what would you say is the best way for practice to demonstrate they've actually learned from feedback that's been provided, whether from the CQC or whether from third parties? And I suppose they're trying to demonstrate they've learned before it goes as far as the CQC.
I think it's genuine reflection, John, and again, keeping a record of that reflection and showing that complaints are not just sitting on a file, but they actually lead to change, not just, again, ticking it off and saying it's resolved. And showing change through complaints can include, practices creating a written reflection on what went wrong, how did we get here, a detail about the actions taken to prevent it happening again. Because if these and again, CQC will look at this, they will look at your complaints log, and if the same things keep coming up, that's a governance issue under Wilde. So how are you looking at this to make sure it doesn't keep repeating? How are you updating your policies, training amongst staff and your systems generally to make sure that any issues are being addressed? And once those lessons have been learned, how are you communicating that to the staff team generally? Because actually, it's one thing for the registered manager or the principals to kind of speak amongst themselves about these incidents, but unless everybody on the ground understands them and how to avoid them, then the lesson hasn't really been learned. It has to go through the whole team. And during inspections, CQC might find that something happened, it was then remedied, and then they'll ask, well, what changed as a result? And if the answer's unclear, the complaints handling process will be reviewed as weak.
Okay. Looking probably more towards the future now. Mindful that business, everything's, things seem to be changing all the time with the rise of digitization, AI. Obviously with kind of dentists now, things are, no take in recorded through AI. What new areas of CQC concern do you think practices should be aware of? I think as we kind of move to a more digital based way of doing work, and looking at things like, as I said, artificial intelligence. What are your thoughts on that, Jenny?
Yeah, it's huge and it grows every day, and CQC will grow with it and become alert to the issues that are rising. And I think what they're focusing on currently is data security. When people do use electronic systems, how accurate are those records? Again, this goes back to how well staff are trained to complete those records and make sure that they're consistent. Where dentists are conducting remote consultations, how safe are they? Have we got any instances of hacking or accessing information of patients that's kept digitally? Just general cybersecurity, really. And I think it's really important now to have a really stringent digital governance policy in place alongside clinical care. If that's the way that your practice is rooted, then you have to provide for the risk that comes with that.
Yeah, and I think healthcare businesses, dental practices, they're kind of very data heavy businesses, personal data, very sensitive data. Are there particular risks around data protection or consent that dental practices often overlook in your experience, do you think?
Definitely. I think they underestimate risks around inadequate access controls for digital records, shared logins, poor password management, which is the same in any kind of business, really, John. One thing that's significant is lack of consent for remote consultations. So how are you it's fine if you're getting it, but how are you recording and retaining those consents so that when CQC come in and look, it's there and easily presented to them? And insecure transmission of clinical images. Even if it's an image of your jaw or a tooth, it's a very personal and sensitive piece of data. So dentists have to be completely aware of their responsibilities in the GDPR and how all of that information is transmitted. But I think the CQC expect practices to demonstrate that any digital system that they have is safe and as well governed as their clinical systems, with clear accountability for data protection.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. Probably the last question from me then before we start delving into some of the questions from the audience. So, how would you say dentists can use lessons from CQC inspections proactively to improve care and mitigate risk in the practice?
I think it's about adjusting your perception of what an inspection is, John. They're not just about avoiding sanctions or trouble. It could be viewed as an opportunity to improve. So any information that you can gather is useful information and it helps you develop and grow. So use findings to strengthen training, governance, your patient safety culture, and an inspection could be used as a benchmark against best practice. So to understand how you're performing as a practice and showing and demonstrating your commitment to quality and safety.
And how would you say, Jenny, then the practice can embed continuous performance rather than just kind of showing they've kind of treated compliance as a one-off exercise?
Yeah.
Possibly kind of touched on it, but yeah, just anything you can maybe kind of use to kind of summarize nicely the idea of just, you say, kind of continuous performance, continuous improvement.
Yeah, I think there's lots of things that we've touched on already that I'll kind of go over again, that just having these strong approaches in place can go a really long way. So regular internal reviews, specifically aligned to the 5 key questions, and looking at your performance internally before somebody externally comes in and evaluates those. Assigning clear ownership for governance tasks. So we've spoken about sometimes there's an informality within practices. Who really is responsible and who's answerable and who's going to ask the questions and make sure that everything's looking good? And integrating audits and learning into routine meetings. I mean, firstly, having routine meetings, but making sure that really crucial aspects of your practice are discussed there, and using inspection feedback as a strategic improvement tool. So it's really taking the information that you get and running with it, really, and making changes where necessary. But the CQC does consistently recognise practices that show momentum and reflection, even where issues have previously existed. We're not going to pretend that all practices are perfect. They're certainly not. But what makes you a better provider and what enables you to have a more successful relationship with the CQC is how you can learn and reflect and grow and document that growth.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. I think that's all I had. We'll move on to some of the questions from our viewers. I think before we do that, just to let everybody know who's watching, these QR codes above our shoulders. I think I'm pointing to mine, but I'm not entirely sure. Hopefully, I am. I feel like I'm well answer. But that will take you just to our corporate healthcare homepage for Acuity. So if you wanted to contact myself or Jenny afterwards, then you can just scan those codes, and that will take you to our landing page where you can find out more about us and what we do. So Jenny, just moving into some of the questions, I think we've already been through a few of these. Interesting one here. Can remote consultations only be carried out after receiving CQC registration?
Depends who the provider is. Where's the information going? Who's conducting the consultation? Is it for a dentist? Yes, my recommendation would be yes. I think always keep an eye on CQC's scope of registration document. If you're doing a consultation, you are effectively executing a regulated activity. So you need to be mindful of what you're doing during that consultation, what information you're providing, what advice you're giving. So yes, basic terms, I would say yes, but would need to know more.
Fine. Okay. Another question. This is more around kind of squat practices. So, setting up a practice from scratch. The question is it necessary to have your staff prior to opening according to the CQC? So I suppose that's more of a business-based question. I suppose ultimately, if you're looking to open, you should be CQC registered. If you're looking to actually treat patients and you say provide that regulated care. So I suppose that's more of a question of, well, timing in terms of at what point you actually need to have your staff on the ground to actually be working for you. But unless you kind of tell me I'm wrong, Jenny, I don't think there's necessarily any requirement to have staff hired before you open the practice. It's all down to how many staff you actually need to have in place to provide that regulated service is probably the feedback there, isn't it?
Absolutely. How many people do you need to meet the needs of the patient? How are you going to effectively deliver the regulated activity? So yeah.
Okay. An interesting one here, and again, this is something that's become more kind of front and center with workplaces. The idea of employee wellbeing programs, are they picked up much by the CQC inspections? Are they on the CQC's radar? If not in dental practices, maybe in any other kind of healthcare providers where there's more kind of detailed inspections. Is employee wellbeing important to the CQC as much as patient wellbeing?
Certainly not as much as patient wellbeing, but it is interestingly a new aspect of what they look for during inspections. When they have conversations with staff, which will be conducted in private, you can expect staff to be asked about how they're treated by their employers, what kind of benefits they get if they feel that they're treated fairly, sickness policies. It isn't something that CQC really used to be interested in or involved in. But over the last year with the new single assessment framework is one of the quality statements that they look at. I've seen it a few times in adult social care. I've not seen it in dental practices just yet. But I think one way to kind of get around those conversations is to be open with staff. If they have any concerns about well-being or about your policies towards them, is encouraging those conversations to be had with you rather than going straight to an inspector. But yeah, it is something interestingly that's being paid attention to by the CQC.
Okay, that's interesting. Another question here, more around I think consistency of approach applied by the CQC whenever they attend practice inspections. I'm assuming that on a case-by-case basis, they'll always go in with the same the same approach no matter where the practice is based, no matter where it's located? Is there any kind of regionality with the CQC? Do they take different approaches depending on where in the country they are, or is there any view on that, Jenny?
Do you know what? One of the major problems with the CQC, John, is it's personality driven. So I wouldn't say there's differences between regions. I honestly think there's differences from inspector to inspector.
Okay.
So what you can see is, particularly in the registered manager-inspector relationship, if there has been some friction there, then I would have seen many, many times an inspector be quite harsh and probably scrutinise a little bit more closely. But conversely, where there's a positive relationship, inspections can be a much easier journey. Geographically, it depends on what's happening, but I don't see it that often. The approach in an ideal world should be completely consistent. It should adhere to the CQC's approach to inspection, which is an internal framework that we don't get to look at. But I would urge people that see any kind of inconsistency to complain about it. If you feel like something is unfair, an inspector is saying something you don't think is reasonable, or judgments are being made about your service that doesn't quite feel right, that's another occasion, in my view, that you should ring your solicitor, or even put in a complaint of your own, because that could result in a really negative inspection or a poor relationship going forward. So I think it's worth calling out inspections that just feel a little bit heavy-handed.
And where would that complaint go, Jenny? Would that go to the CQC? Or is there an ombudsman? Is there anyone? I mean, who inspects the inspector, as it were?
Well, that's the age-old question, John. It would go to CQC in the first instance, and when that comes back, more often than not, unfortunately, they will side with each other and say, "We didn't say that. Well, that's not our memory of what happened there." And then in those situations, you can go to the ombudsman. I will say that waiting times from the ombudsman are probably about a year at the moment. But I have done many successful complaints that have resulted in changes of rating or changes of wording in an inspection report. So it's absolutely worth doing. And people should not be deterred from doing it because they're worried about rocking the boat or upsetting their inspector so that the relationship breaks down. It's actually better that you do it so that you're treated more fairly and with more caution going forward.
Great. Okay, thanks, Jenny. I am mindful. I think some of the questions are quite detailed here in terms of things like asbestos, Legionella, which I think might be better served if they're answered separately and we follow back on those. So I think if you've asked kind of questions of those nature, Jenny and I will come back to you separately in the next few days just to kind of give our thoughts on that when we've looked into it in a bit more detail, because I'm conscious that's a bit more technical in terms of actually, kind of dealing with surveys and everything else. So we'll kind of come back to you when we can on those. I think just for a last question, and maybe this is kind of pointing towards the future of the CQC, Jenny. One of our viewers has actually saying they actually wouldn't mind working with the CQC to be a professional. Do you have any tips? Do they need to get any qualifications? What are your thoughts on that?
Depends if they mean as an inspector.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily need to be, you have to have experience, and I will say it's a very, very difficult job. At the moment, there's a very tricky culture at the CQC. That's not to say it's not a good place to work. I don't know, I don't work there. But people that inspect dentists are often former dentists. The same goes for social care. They could be former care workers or social workers or commissioners. So yes, your expertise would be probably very well sought after by the CQC.
Good stuff. Just one more, Jenny, before we wrap up. How much notice does the CQC give for routine or unannounced inspections? And if the CQC chooses an inspection date that my practice is not open, does it need to be rescheduled, or does the inspection take place come what may?
Well, if it is a routine inspection, you will probably get a phone call. And that's a major difference between dentists and everybody else that's inspected by the CQC. Most inspections are unannounced in adult social care, for example. But in the NHS and with dentists, you will get a telephone call, I would say probably about 2 weeks before, which is incredibly helpful and unheard of in the social care sector. So they will be green with envy. However, if it's an inspection that's been triggered by a risk or an adverse report, a complaint, you will not have an announcement. They will just arrive on your door. If you're closed, that is what it is. You know, I guess they'll have to come back another day. But if they know that you're not open consistently, they will probably contact you or come on a day that you are open. But anything that's derived out of a risk is more likely to be a terrible surprise.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Jenny. I think we will leave it there. But yeah, really a huge thanks to you for taking the time to share your expertise. I'm sure everybody watching this webinar, either live or afterwards, will have found all of your insights really valuable. Just to say, obviously, you know where we are now. You've hopefully got our details. If there's any questions you have for us following on from this, please do reach out to us. We will endeavour to come back to all those questions we haven't answered as soon as we can in the coming days. But really, just to summarise, you know, CQC inspections, I think Jenny's demonstrated, they aren't just compliance tick box exercises. They are a measure of how well your practice protects patients and delivers quality care. Understanding their powers and approach helps you not only meet standards, but proactively enhance the safety, effectiveness, and reputation of your practice. So just remember, it's not about fearing inspections. It's about using them to build a practice that patients and regulators can trust. So on that note, thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your evenings. Thank you.
Thank you.